journey began with a sound none of them could mistake. The heavy clatter of steel wheels grinding across a frozen rail line. It was some time after dawn when the German prisoners were marched from the docks toward a long line of Canadian troop trains waiting in the brittle Atlantic air. The ocean fog clung to their uniforms and stung their cheeks. Many were still young, barely old enough to shave, while others carried the worn, hollow look of men who had survived too much already. None of them knew where they were going. The rumors they whispered in the ranks ranged from grim to absurd. Remote work camps, underground mines, secret Allied interrogations. A few even joked bitterly that they might be dropped into the Arctic tundra and forgotten entirely. Before they boarded, a Canadian officer addressed them in clear, measured German. He reminded them that the war was still being fought fiercely across Europe, but that here, in Canada, they were to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention. Food would be provided, medical treatment offered. No one would be harmed unless they attempted escape. His voice was calm, even polite, which unsettled the prisoners more than if he had barked orders. Politeness from the enemy felt like a trick. Yet nothing about the scene hinted at malice. The guards carried rifles, yes, but they held them loosely, as if expecting no trouble. The prisoners stepped into the train cars 2 by 2, escorted by guards who addressed them with quiet nods rather than shouted commands. Inside, the wooden benches were cold and bare, but not nearly as cramped as the cattle wagons many of them had feared. Some sat rigidly, refusing to relax, while others leaned back with heavy sighs. The air smelled of wet wool and the faint metallic scent of the train itself. One young prisoner named Carl pressed his forehead against the frosted window and tried to see something familiar outside. All he could make out was a blur of gray coastline and the silhouettes of distant evergreen forests stretching endlessly inland. When the train lurched forward, a strange silence filled the car. Only the rhythmic thundering of the wheels broke the stillness. For hours the prisoners rode in uneasy quiet, aware of the guards seated among them, but surprised that none acted aggressively. After a time, one guard near the front removed his gloves and rubbed his hands for warmth. He noticed a prisoner staring. "Cold morning," the guard muttered in accented German. The prisoner blinked, unsure whether he was being mocked. "Cold," he agreed reluctantly. Moments later, the guard unwrapped a small tin of hard candy from his coat pocket and wordlessly offered it to the nearest few prisoners. They stared at it as if he had produced a weapon. No German officer would have shared supplies with captives, yet this Canadian seemed to think nothing of the gesture. A few prisoners hesitated before taking a piece. Carl watched all of it in disbelief, silently wondering what sort of country they had been taken to. As the hours passed, the fog thinned and sunlight spilled across the wide Canadian landscape. Towering pines and spruce flashed by the windows, broken occasionally by frozen lakes that glittered in the morning light. The prisoners had imagined North America as a land of massive cities, roaring factories, and endless highways. Instead, they found themselves rolling deeper into a wilderness that seemed ancient and untouched. Snow blanketed everything, softening the edges of the world until the land looked almost otherworldly. "Where is this train taking us?" a prisoner whispered. "North," another answered, though he had no idea. Or west, or maybe nowhere at all. They were wrong about at least one thing. The route was not random. The Canadian government had quietly constructed dozens of POW camps deep within the interior provinces, far from any coastline or population center. The isolation itself was the best guard. Even if a prisoner escaped, he would face hundreds of kilometers of forest, mountains, and winter. Most Canadians living in towns and farms had no idea how many German POWs were hidden in their country. Official reports downplayed the numbers. Rumors filled the gaps. Only the military and a handful of local workers knew the truth. By midday, the train slowed as it approached a small siding carved into a slope of white hills. The guards instructed the prisoners to gather their belongings. Carl tried to see what lay ahead, but the snow whipped wildly against the window, obscuring everything except a series of wooden towers and barbed wire fences rising through the drifting haze. When the doors opened, cold air punched into the car. The prisoners stepped out onto a platform surrounded by towering evergreens and deep snowbanks. It felt as though they had arrived at the edge of the world. A Canadian sergeant with a red maple leaf patch on his sleeve addressed them once more. His breath hung in the air as he spoke. "Welcome to your new home. Follow the path to registration. Do as instructed, and you will have no trouble. Respect the guards, and they will respect you." The sincerity in his voice stunned several prisoners. Ernst, a former mechanic from Hamburg, whispered, "They speak to us like people, not prisoners." "Maybe that's the trick," Carl said. But even he felt the knot of tension in his chest ease when he realized the guards were not threatening them at all. As they walked, he noticed wooden barracks rising in neat rows, smoke curling from chimneys, and the faint smell of stew drifting through the cold air. Dogs barked somewhere near the far fence, but the guards handling them looked relaxed rather than aggressive. Inside the registration hut, a corporal handed each man a small booklet with his name, identification number, and assigned bunk. He also handed them something none of them expected: a set of work clothes, thick wool gloves, and a pair of sturdy boots. These items were standard issue in Canadian military stores, but felt luxurious compared to the ragged uniforms many POWs had been captured in. As Carl accepted his boots, he asked cautiously, "Why give us such things? We are prisoners." The corporal shrugged. "You will be working outside? Winter here is colder than anything you have seen. We keep prisoners alive. It is the rule." Carl stared at him, uncertain whether he was telling the truth, then quietly moved on. The barracks were plain but warm, heated by wood-burning stoves at either end. Straw mattresses lined the walls. The prisoners entered hesitantly, expecting filth or overcrowding, yet the interior smelled of pine and fresh lumber. Some men sat down for the first time without fear. Others wandered the aisles in disbelief. Later that afternoon, when the sun was already sinking behind the tree line, the guards led the prisoners to the mess hall. Long wooden tables filled the space, and large pots of stew simmered near the back. The food was simple but hot and hearty. Potatoes, carrots, flour dumplings, occasionally small cuts of meat. The prisoners watched carefully to see whether the guards would mock them or deny portions. Instead, the Canadian cooks served them with the same patience they used for their own soldiers. Halfway through the meal, a prisoner muttered, "Is this a trick to lower our guard?" Another replied, "If it is, they play it well." Carl listened quietly. Spoon paused mid-air. The warmth of the food seeped through him, a warmth he had almost forgotten. He kept waiting for the harsh command, the angry outburst, the sudden cruelty he had learned to expect during the war. But it never came. The guards spoke softly among themselves. A few told jokes. The atmosphere felt surreal. Later that evening, after the prisoners had settled in their bunks, the camp lights dimmed and the guards made their final rounds. Carl lay awake, staring at the rafters above him. Snow tapped gently against the windows. He thought of home, of the uncertainty that lay ahead, and of the strange civility he had seen from the Canadians. It felt unnerving, as if the world had tilted on its axis. He whispered to Ernst in the next bunk, "What kind of prison is this?" Ernst answered softly, "One we do not understand yet." Outside, the wind picked up again, sweeping through the treetops with a low hum. The guards moved quietly along the perimeter, silhouettes against the faint lantern glow. The camp was isolated, surrounded by endless forest, but it was strangely calm. Carl felt himself drifting into sleep, still uncertain, but no longer afraid. He did not know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Beneath the stillness of that frozen night lay a secret the prisoners were not meant to discover. In the days ahead, they would learn why this camp was unlike any other in the entire war, and why whispers of its existence would one day spread through the German ranks like a legend. The train that had carried them into the wilderness was gone now, swallowed by the night. What remained was a question that would haunt every prisoner who stepped into Canada's hidden frontier. What awaited them beyond these quiet fences, and why were their captors treating them not as enemies, but as workers, guests, or something stranger still? The answer was coming, carried by the steady rhythm of the Canadian winter and the peculiar rules of a camp that defied the logic of war. Morning arrived not with a bugle or shouted orders, but with the muffled thump of boots outside the barracks and the smell of wood smoke drifting through the frosted windows. Carl woke to the sight of pale sunlight stretching across the floorboards like thin gold ribbons. For a moment he forgot he was a prisoner at all. The quiet, the warmth from the stove, the faint chatter of men preparing for the day, all felt strangely peaceful. Then the creak of the barrack door broke the spell as a guard stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "Line up outside for roll call," he said in German. His tone was firm but polite, as if he were instructing workers on a farm rather than managing prisoners of war. The men exchanged uncertain glances. No threats, no shouting. They filed outside into the cold morning with rising confusion. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of cold that stung the lungs but carried the scent of pine and distant river ice. The guards, wearing thick winter coats with red maple leaf patches on the shoulders, counted each prisoner with quiet efficiency. Afterward, a lieutenant approached with a clipboard. The prisoners tensed as he surveyed them. "Today, you will be assigned to work details," he announced. "Forestry teams, farm labor, maintenance, and other tasks. You will receive payment for your work according to the Geneva Convention. Payment will be in canteen credits. You may purchase goods of your choice." A stunned silence rolled through the prisoners like a shockwave. Payment. Goods of their choice. Carl stared at the lieutenant, trying to decide whether this was a trick or a translation mistake. Ernst whispered, "Did he say payment?" "He did," Carl replied, his voice barely audible. "What sort of prison pays its captives?" Minutes later, they were divided into groups. Carl was assigned to a forestry crew. The guards led them along a snow-packed trail outside the main compound. The forest loomed tall and ancient, branches heavy with fresh snow. The prisoners were given axes and saws, real tools rather than dulled or sabotaged ones. A Canadian foreman explained their task with slow, deliberate German. Cut designated trees, stack logs, clear brush. The work was hard and the air burned their lungs, but something about the routine felt almost familiar. Many of the men had worked as carpenters, farmers, or laborers before the war. Their hands remembered the movements, even if their minds were still struggling to understand the situation. Around midday, the foreman called for a break. He opened a large thermos and set it in the snow. "Hot tea?" he said, gesturing for the prisoners to drink. The men exchanged wary glances. The idea of drinking anything offered by guards felt unnatural. But the foreman simply waited, his gloved hands resting on his knees. Eventually, Ernst stepped forward and poured himself a cup. He tasted it, swallowed, then nodded to the others. "It is just tea," he said. The prisoners crowded around, cupping the steaming tin cups between frozen fingers. Carl felt warmth spread through him as the steam curled upward, melting the frost from his eyelashes. The foreman stood beside him, looking out across the forest. "Hard work," he said in German. Carl nodded. "We have done worse." "I believe it," the foreman replied. "But at least here, it is honest work." Carl turned to him. "Why treat us so kindly? We are your enemy." The foreman took a long breath before answering. "Maybe. But you are also men far from home, and the war will end someday. How we treat you now will matter when that day comes." Carl had no answer. He stared at the snow-covered trees, unsure whether to feel gratitude or suspicion. At dusk, they returned to the camp, tools slung over their shoulders. The mess hall was warm and bright. The cook served stew again, this time with bread and a small serving of jam. The prisoners ate ravenously. At a nearby table, a guard laughed at a joke told by another Canadian. The sound drifted through the hall like something from another world. Carl watched them, puzzled by the ease with which the guards existed in the same space as their captives. After dinner, the prisoners were told they could visit the camp canteen. They filed inside with a mix of nerves and curiosity. The canteen shelves were stocked with items the prisoners never imagined they would see. Writing paper, chocolate bars, tobacco, canned fruit, postcards, even small games. A corporal stood behind the counter, flipping through a ledger as each man approached. Carl stepped forward, his new POW booklet in hand. The corporal stamped it and handed it back. "You earned 30 cents today," he said. Carl blinked hard. 30 cents for cutting trees. "Correct," the corporal confirmed. "Spend it how you wish." Carl stared down at the stamped page, astonishment swirling inside him. In Germany, even civilians struggled to afford basic goods. Yet here a prisoner could earn chocolate with an axe and a day's work. Ernst joined him at his side. "Buy something," Ernst urged, "just to see if they let us." Carl pointed to a small bar of chocolate behind the counter. The corporal wrapped it neatly in paper and handed it to him. No hesitation, no tricks. Carl held the chocolate as though it were a precious artifact. For a moment he forgot he was a prisoner at all. He felt like a boy again, standing at a bakery with coins his mother had given him. That night in the barracks, the men examined the items they had bought. Tobacco pouches rustled. Chocolate wrappers crinkled. The room buzzed with disbelief. Ernst looked at Carl and shook his head. "This cannot be real," he said. "No army in Europe would treat prisoners this way." Carl lay back on his bunk. It makes no sense. If we are enemies, why give us anything? Why pay us? "Maybe it is their way of showing superiority," another man suggested. "A kind of psychological tactic." Carl considered this. But the more he thought about the foreman offering tea, or the corporal stamping his booklet, the less it felt like a tactic, and the more it felt like simple humanity. It was disarming. A week passed, then another. The routine repeated itself with strange consistency. Work, wages, canteen purchases, warm meals, respectful guards, even recreation time. On clear evenings, some prisoners played football in the snow while guards watched with amusement. Music drifted from a radio in the administrative building. The prisoners heard news reports of battles in Europe, reminders that the war continued even as they lived in a camp that felt detached from reality. One afternoon, Carl was called to help mend fencing along the outer perimeter. As he worked, a guard named Cooper stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You work well," Cooper said. Carl shrugged. "I only do what is required." "More than required," Cooper replied. "You could be lazy. Some men try that. You don't." Carl hesitated. "Where is this camp exactly? What do you call it?" "Camp 27, Cooper answered. "A lot of folks don't know it exists. Safer that way." "Safer for whom?" Carl asked. Cooper looked out across the forest. "For everyone." Carl returned to his work, but the guard's answer stayed with him. A camp that people did not know existed. A camp that paid prisoners. A camp that felt more like a remote settlement than a prison. The secrecy only made the strangeness sharper. By late winter, the prisoners had settled into a rhythm. But one question continually hung in the air. Why were they being treated so well? What did the Canadian government gain from it? What purpose did this strange camp serve? The guards never explained. The officers said only that the rules came from Ottawa. No one challenged those rules. The system worked, so no one questioned its logic. Yet one night, after lights out, Carl awoke to the sound of hushed voices near the far end of the barracks. A pair of prisoners whispered with urgent intensity, speaking of rumors picked up from guards, interpreters, or intercepted supply memos. Carl edged closer, listening. "They say the Canadians want us to work harder than their soldiers. They want to break our loyalty with fairness. They want us to return to Germany praising this place." "That makes no sense," the other replied. "No one will believe us." "Maybe that's the point." Carl backed away silently. Whatever the truth was, it was clear the prisoners were now caught in something larger than simple captivity. Something shaped by politics, propaganda, and a belief that war could be fought not just with guns, but with treatment that contradicted hatred. As he lay back in his bunk, Carl stared at the ceiling, wondering what tomorrow's work would bring and what unseen decisions guided the strange kindness of their captors. The camp felt calm, but beneath that calmness was a tension he could not quite name. He sensed that they were being prepared for something, though he did not know for what. And as the winter wind circled the barracks and whispered against the walls, he felt a quiet certainty that the secret of this place was far more complicated than the wages printed in his small booklet. The truth was coming, carried in rumors, in guarded glances, and in the uneasy realization that this camp did not exist simply to hold prisoners. It existed to change them. Spring arrived subtly in the Canadian interior, carried first by the sound of dripping eaves and the softening of snowbanks along the fences. The prisoners noticed the change long before they felt it. Birds returned to the treetops, filling the morning roll call with bursts of song. The river near the work trails began to crack its icy shell. Even the guards seemed lighter, laughing more easily, moving with the confidence of men who no longer had to brace against the bitter cold. Carl welcomed the change, but with the thaw came a growing tide of uncertainty. He could not shake the feeling that life in Camp 27 had shifted from strange to something even more complex. One morning, while the prisoners waited for assignment, Lieutenant Harris approached with a clipboard and a peculiar expression. "You have exceeded your winter quotas," he announced. "Your work groups brought in more timber and completed more repairs than expected. Headquarters noted your performance." He paused, letting the murmurs settle. "As a result, new privileges will be introduced. Additional canteen credits will be awarded for every full week of labor completed." The prisoners exchanged looks of disbelief. Extra pay for hard work, official recognition. It was unthinkable in a prison camp, yet it was happening before their eyes. Ernst let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Next, they will promote us to officers," he muttered. Carl smiled politely, though the announcement unsettled him. He wondered why the Canadians were so invested in shifting the prisoners from enemies to workers. The camp seemed to operate on a philosophy none of them could quite grasp. Rather than break the captives through punishment, the Canadians seemed determined to reshape them through decency. The new system changed everything. The prisoners worked with renewed energy, not because they were coerced, but because their efforts were rewarded with real, tangible freedom. In the canteen, the shelves expanded each month as regional supply trucks delivered everything from shaving cream to harmonicas. Soon the prisoners began sending small packages home through the International Red Cross. They purchased writing paper, wrapped chocolate and fruit, and composed letters in careful handwriting. The guards mailed them without inspection, honoring international law. One evening, Carl sat at a wooden table in the barracks, penning a letter to his mother in Hamburg. He paused often, unsure how much of the truth he should reveal. How could he explain that his captors treated him with respect? How could he describe earning wages, drinking tea with a foreman, or buying chocolate after a day's work in the forest? It sounded like a lie, even to him. After a long moment, he wrote simply, "I am treated well. I work. I earn small wages. Do not worry." When he sealed the letter, he felt a quiet warmth in his chest. Writing home made him feel human again. The transformation inside the camp deepened with each passing week. The guards no longer felt like barriers between two worlds. They seemed like participants in a cautious, unspoken truce. There were card games played during evening recreation, informal debates about politics over cups of watery coffee, and even moments of humor that flickered across cultural lines. One guard, Cooper, told stories of his childhood on a prairie farm, and laughed when Ernst joked that he could never understand why Canadians trusted winter to end. Yet, not everyone accepted the atmosphere so easily. Some prisoners, particularly older officers, viewed the Canadian approach with suspicion. They believed kindness was a weapon, something designed to erode loyalty to the Reich. Late at night, they whispered warnings about propaganda, cultural manipulation, and psychological warfare. A few urged the younger men to resist the temptation of comfort. "They want you soft," one officer warned during roll call. "They want you docile. They want to turn you into an example of their supposed superiority." Carl listened quietly, but found the argument hollow. The Canadians did not preach. They did not pressure. They simply treated the prisoners like workers, like men. If that was manipulation, it was a kind, he could not recognize. The tension came to a head on a warm afternoon when a group of prisoners was assigned to help sort lumber near the river. Carl worked alongside Cooper, stacking boards in neat rows. Voices carried on the breeze, and laughter drifted from a nearby group. Then a sharp argument erupted behind them. An older German officer, Captain Reiter, was berating one of the younger prisoners. "You smile with them," Reiter hissed. "You play games with them. You buy their food. You are losing yourself." The younger man clenched his fists. "I am surviving. That is all." "Survival is loyalty," Reiter snapped, "not surrender." Before the argument escalated, Lieutenant Harris approached, hands clasped behind his back. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "is there a problem?" Reiter straightened. "No problem, Lieutenant. Just a conversation." Harris met his gaze without hostility. "Remember that conversation is a privilege we grant here. Work is required. Argument is not." His tone never sharpened, yet the message settled over the prisoners with unmistakable authority. Reiter stepped back, and work resumed. Carl resumed stacking lumber, grateful for the interruption. When he glanced at Cooper, the guard simply shrugged. "Some men carry the war longer than others," Cooper said. As spring stretched into early summer, something remarkable began to happen. The prisoners started to save their earnings. They pooled wages to buy tools for crafts, forming small workshops inside unused storage sheds. Some carved wooden toys, others repaired boots or instruments. Carl helped build a small chess set with hand-carved pieces. The guards allowed it without hesitation. The camp seemed to operate on a belief that occupied minds created stable men. What none of the prisoners realized was that Canada's approach was part of a larger strategy. The government had studied the Geneva Convention closely. Treating prisoners humanely reduced the chances of escape, encouraged productivity, and improved international standing. But there was another reason, one rarely spoken aloud. Many Canadians believed that decency was a weapon in its own right, a way to challenge the ideology that fueled the war. If a German soldier returned home speaking of fairness, humanity, and cooperation from the so-called enemy, then perhaps seeds of doubt would sprout in the ruins of Europe. Carl began to sense the deeper truth during a conversation with Lieutenant Harris late one evening. The lieutenant had stopped by the workshop to inspect the chess set. He turned one of the carved knights in his hand and nodded with approval. "You have skill," he said. "What did you do before the war?" "I was an apprentice carpenter," Carl replied, "before everything changed." Harris placed the piece back on the board. "Everything will change again after the war. You will have choices to make. Work like this will matter." Carl studied him. "Why do you say things like that? Why speak as though we are not enemies?" Harris leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. His voice was calm but earnest. "Because war ends, people remain. If we act with cruelty, you take that memory home. If we act with fairness, you take that memory home instead. What you remember shapes what you rebuild." Carl absorbed the words slowly. They unsettled him in a way no guard tower ever could. By midsummer, the atmosphere inside Camp 27 had shifted from simple coexistence to something fragile but undeniably hopeful. The prisoners no longer moved with stiff caution. They walked the grounds with ease, greeted guards with nods, and worked with a steadiness that came not from fear, but from routine. Even Reiter, once the loudest critic, had quieted. though he maintained his distance. The real impact of the camp revealed itself one evening as the sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the perimeter fence. The prisoners gathered on the field for a football match. Guards watched from the sidelines, cheering with the same energy as the prisoners. The game was close, competitive, filled with laughter and shouts. Carl sprinted across the field, boots kicking up dust, heart pounding with a strange sense of freedom. When the game ended, both teams shook hands without hesitation. Cooper clapped Carl on the shoulder. "You look like a man who forgot he's in prison," Cooper said. Carl took a long breath, looking around at the smiling faces, the sunset, the distant hills. "Sometimes I do forget," he admitted quietly. Cooper nodded. "Good. That means something is working." But the war outside the camp was turning. News reports crackled across radios, telling of Allied advances, German retreats, collapsing fronts. The prisoners listened in silence, each man confronting the reality that their world was changing faster than they could comprehend. When Germany finally surrendered, the camp did not erupt in celebration or anger. Instead, a heavy stillness settled over it. The prisoners moved through the day as though walking underwater. Carl felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The war had taken so much from everyone, yet in this frozen corner of Canada, he had found something oddly steady. The guards had treated them not with contempt, but with dignity. The work had given them purpose. The wages, small as they were, had offered a sense of autonomy lost in combat. The announcement of repatriation came a week later. The prisoners would be returned to Europe in phases. Each man would carry his earnings with him, along with letters, carved crafts, and memories that defied the logic of war. On the day Carl boarded the transport truck that would take him from Camp 27, Cooper approached with a small envelope. "Your final wages," he said, "and something extra." Carl opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph taken during the football match. It showed the prisoners and guards standing side by side, smiling. He looked up, bewildered. "Why give me this?" Cooper shrugged lightly. "Because you earned it. And because maybe one day you will tell someone what happened here." Carl closed the envelope carefully, feeling its weight as though it contained more than paper. He climbed into the truck, gripping the wooden railing as the engine rumbled to life. The camp receded behind him, its fences and barracks shrinking into the vast Canadian wilderness. As the truck turned onto the long dirt road leading toward the rail line, Carl watched the camp fade from view. The wind carried the scent of pine and warm earth. He felt an unexpected ache in his chest, not of fear or woes, but of gratitude for a strange place that had reshaped him in ways he had not anticipated. Camp 27 had been built as a prison, hidden in the snowy silence of a distant frontier. Yet through wages earned in pennies, quiet dignity, and a new kind of war fought with fairness rather than hatred, it had become something else entirely. A place where enemies learned to see one another as men. A place where memories of decency outlasted the noise of conflict. As the wilderness closed behind him and the future opened before him, Carl understood the truth at last. The war had taken his freedom, but Canada had given him something no coin could purchase. It had given him a new way to see the world.